All right, good evening, everybody. I want to thank everybody for who've been able to join. Thank you very much. Today we go straight to business. Very sorry for being behind time, but I really appreciate those who have been able to join. I hope others will be able to join also along the way. Okay, so a quick recap on what we have been doing so far. This class is actually a class that is focusing on young people, University of Ibadan students. I hope they get to watch it subsequently because I've not seen any student join the broadcast right now. Okay, so it's actually a class on the Christian gospel. We're trying to explain why the message of Christianity is what it is. And right now, at the point where we are in, we're actually focusing on church history. So last week I was on a live internet program and I couldn't join this broadcast or couldn't go about with this broadcast. But today we resumed and we're grateful to God for the blessing of life. And so right now I'm going to share my screen and go straight to my discussion for today. Okay, so that's my screen. I have a full screen from there. Okay. All right. So far, the very first discussion that we had, I looked at the whole story around my own conversion. It's healthy that we all examine ourselves in the faith to know whether we are at all in the faith. So I looked at that and I tried to explain the fact that I must have experienced two types of conversion. You know, till today, I'm still not sure where and when the Holy Spirit did his work in my heart. But I know I had two experiences. The first one was Pentecostal-like. The second one was my exposure to the gospel of Christ. You know, and today, what I do is that I am not very enthusiastic about bringing people Pentecostal experiences. In fact, I try to discourage it. You know, so what I do and what I know converts people is the gospel of Christ. So that's what I try to press upon people's hearts. And that's what I'm trying to do today. And we now moved in the next class to the matter of church history, still along that line, where we began to examine how exactly have Christianity lived or existed in the past 2,000 years. You know, we've seen different things. The first one we looked at was what happened and how Christianity was after the days of the apostle. We look at the first century after first 100 years after Christ died and rose again. Okay, and we looked at how our Bible was preserved. Okay, we saw how our Bible came about having our Bibles. We saw that there were so many books, littering the churches, and all of them, many of them were claiming apostolic succession or the apostolic connection. You know, but the Christians of those days were wise enough to focus on. They said, okay, that we wanted only books written by the apostles that were known by the churches to have been written by the apostles, and these things were not difficult to know because people who succeeded the apostles, people like Irenaeus. There's this man called Justin Matthias, Polycarp, and so on. All these people, they wrote a lot of epistles. In fact, somebody said that if we were to follow the letters and the writings of these men, we could actually reconstruct the whole Bible from their writings alone. You know, so they quoted scriptures copiously, and the scriptures they quoted were usually scriptures that were the apostles wrote. So the church fathers located scriptures that were written by the apostles, and they located a few others that were written by associates of the apostles. And that's how we came about our four gospels and the epistles of Paul and all the epistles of the other apostles of our Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, then subsequently, we now looked at three heresies. Okay, the Arianan heresy was in the 4th century. In AD 325, there was the very first council, Christian council. Okay, bishops came together to discuss whether Jesus Christ was God or not. And they came to the conclusion that Arius was a heretic and the Arianan concept was actually heresy. Okay, and that was banished. In the 2nd century, unfortunately, our power has failed. And I'm just going to do this thing. I'm going to start, pause the recording. Thank God I'm on recording. So you guys should just give me a minute. Just proceed. I continue the sharing of my video. Okay, so so we came across these three heresies, very important heresies. And those heresies, in fact, the heresies were very good because they helped the churches to define clearly what we believed. I suspect that the sound of this generator is reaching this place. So guys, just give me 1 minute. So heresies were good. They helped the churches to define clearly what the church had always believed over the years. And these heresies are also important for us to study because their kings and cousins are still with us today. So Arians, there are still Arians today. People, the Jehovah Witnesses and so on, they actually believe a lot that Arians also believe. Pelagianism is actually, it's also a very, very important heresy, which unfortunately the churches are not very familiar with. Okay, Pelagianism was that doctrine that taught that man is saved by his effort alone. God has done everything. All we have to do is just to grab what God has done. Okay, but what's his name? Augustine disputed Pelagius and clearly showed that Pelagius was a heretic. Okay, and that very, very important. Unfortunately, the same Roman Catholic Church that helped, I believe, in the Council of Orange to clearly show that Pelagius was a heretic. By the 16th century, but even up to today, they are still largely Pelagius in their doctrine. Okay, so it's a very, very important doctrinal or heretical position that we need to comprehend so that we also can separate from it. Pelagius believed that man is saved by his human effort alone. Man was not born with original sin, okay, and all of those things. Man does not need grace to be saved, okay. But most of what we have today, which is semi-Pelagians, they believe that man can save himself by with a combination with God's effort, okay. But we reject all of that. We follow what Augustine taught when he said that man is saved by faith and through grace alone, okay. And then the last heresy, which is Islam, is actually a very, very important heresy because we have the world is about 7 billion people, and we have about 2.5 billion Muslims in the world today. Okay, so Islam is also a very, very important heresy. I think we'll still be touching on Islam in our today's discussion. So you just follow me as we go on with our discussion for today. Then it appears that my laptop is not changing the screen. Okay, all right. So today, our discussion today will start with the 11th century, something called the Great Schism. Don't forget that we are examining the church history. We're looking at how the Christianity has been passed on to us, how the gospel has been preserved, how many things had threatened the message of the gospel, so that today when we are preaching, we know how to preserve our own gospel, and we also know how to contend for it, okay? And then when we preach the gospel, we know what to focus on, because there's really nothing new that we're preaching today that's not been done in the past, okay? So next, I would like to move fast forward to a few hundred years after Muhammad was born. It's important to know that much of the ancient world was quite religious. While Islam was the dominant religion in the eastern parts of the world, the West was ruled by Christianity. And when we talk about the West, we're looking at Europe. And then when we talk about the East, we're looking at Saudi Arabia, even Israel, and so on and so forth. And then to the south of all of those, we have Africa and all of that. Now, in fact, prior to the coming of Islam, much of the East had also been dominated by Christianity. I see this church history that I'm discussing is actually a summary, okay? And when I say this, I actually also how do I call it? I also overlook the fact that in the East, in the East, Christianity started from the eastern part of the world. Okay, Jesus Christ was born in the East. Okay, Christianity started to spread from the eastern part of the world. And before Islam, Christianity was the dominant religion or the dominant force in the eastern part of the world. But it's important to note, and I just learned that very recently, that 150 years after Muhammad had died, Islam had conquered 3/4 of the eastern parts of the world. Islam had conquered 3/4. They had become the dominant force both politically and religious-wise. In fact, in about 100 years after Muhammad's death, Islam made effort to enter into Europe. And they took over, in fact, at some point, Spain was ruled by Muslim sheikh for a long time. Only, I think very recently, I think maybe the 15th century, was Spain eventually taken over by Christianity. Okay, so the eastern part of Europe was almost being conquered by Islam, but Christian warlords and so on made the effort. That's another part of history entirely, which is also something that is worth studying in itself. Okay, so in fact, prior to the coming of Islam, much of the East had been dominated by Christianity. There's a Christian denomination in the East, okay, called the Eastern Orthodox Church that used to be quite dominant in much of what we know as the Middle East today. Okay, so in Russia, we still have the Eastern Orthodox churches. In Egypt, we still have Eastern Orthodox churches and many other Middle Eastern areas like that. Now, prior to the 11th century, much of the world's Christianity was actually under one umbrella. Okay, everybody were under one whole umbrella. But in 1054, something called the Great Schism occurred. The Eastern Orthodox churches split away from their counterparts in the West, the Roman Catholic Church. The dispute actually was over an article of doctrine regarding the exact manner the Holy Spirit was supposed to be presented in the Trinity. The details of that I won't be able to go into in this discussion. There was, however, a greater underlying factor in the dispute, between the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Western Church, that's the Roman Catholic Church, that had to do with the ecclesiastical rivalry between the leaders of the two arms of the churches. Okay, so since the fall of Rome in the 5th century, the Bishop of Rome, which is in the West, okay, don't forget that Rome is Italy. Okay, so the Bishop of Rome, which is in the West, and the Bishop of Constantinople, which is in the East, that's Constantinople is in present-day Turkey, okay, which is towards the East, had never really did agreed over who was to be subordinate to the other. Okay, so for a long time in the churches, we actually had a situation where, how do I call that? I'm going to ask, I got to stop his video. It's distracting me. Okay, so the two bishops were actually, there had actually been some kind of competition between them. Okay, so the how will I call it? The Bishop of Rome felt that he was the head of the church, while the Bishop of Constantinople thought that he was the head of the church. Okay, Christianity did start from Rome, but what's his name? Constantine moved the headquarters of Rome to Constantinople, you know, and he had a church there, and the Bishop of Constantinople felt that he was supposed to be the head. So that there was that issue. Okay, as all of this issue was happening, do not forget that there was also an underlying force below, and that was the emerging force of Islam. Okay, so while in 1054 the church is divided, okay, and the Western Church led by the Roman Catholic Church moved to their own way, the Eastern churches led by the Bishop of Constantinople actually were on their own, but they were also vulnerable to incursion by Islam. Okay, so that because of that division, eventually we had a situation where the churches in the East became very vulnerable and they continued to dwindle in size. In fact, I learned that in the beginning of the 19th century, 20th century, 10%, if not 25%, I think maybe 15%. Let's just say this 15% of the Middle East still had Christians. There are 15% of the population of the Middle East were still Christian. Today, that number is very much less than 5%. Okay, it would also, okay, this dispute will eventually culminate in the division between the two churches in 1054 called the Great Schism. It will also give Islam greater powers in gaining ground in hitherto Christian nations in the East. Okay, so you find out that there was upon a time when the whole of Turkey used to be Christian. In fact, most of the churches that John wrote his letter to in Revelation were churches in Turkey. Okay, the whole of Turkey used to be East. The whole of Syria used to be Christian. The whole of Syria used to be Christian. The whole of Egypt used to be Christian. In fact, the whole of the Middle East, Algeria, Augustine came from Algeria. You know, the whole of Algeria used to be Christian. Tunisia used to be Christian. You know, but all of these countries are raving Islamic countries today. Okay, and why? Because there was a schism and the churches in the East became vulnerable and they were eventually taken over by Islam. By the 16th century, the Roman Catholic Church held ecclesiastic powers over all of Europe. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century would, however, change all of that. Okay, so I am going to have to pause here and ask if we have any question or any contribution. My boss has joined the discussion. That is Professor Moturayo Adetola from Canada. And he was the one that told me that you shouldn't just rush. To ask, allow people to give a response, okay? So Paul Owolabi, Dr. Moturayo, Said, so far, is there any question, any contribution, or can I proceed with my discussion?
My question is, I wasn't really clear about the schism, what the schism did to bring about the Islamic revolution within those countries that used to be Christian nations.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. In fact, thank God I paused. I didn't have to move. I didn't need to move to the next one. Okay. All right. So in the last class we had, we found out that Muhammad was born in 570 AD. Okay. And he died in 632 AD. All right. Now, the moment Muhammad died, he was succeeded by some very powerful caliphates. And this gentleman made strenuous effort to spread Islam to around the Middle East, excuse me, and into the Western world, into Europe. Okay. So, and when we're saying they are making efforts to spread, they weren't just coming to people and saying, become Muslims. No, they were, I mean, it was with the force of the sword. They were conquering nations and they were converting people en masse. Okay. Now, to be fair to the Muslims, they were not always using the sword and say, you must be a Muslim, you must be a Muslim. No. What they usually would do is that they will take over a country. Okay. They will install a caliphate, they will install a leader, and the person will turn the country into a Muslim country. Okay. Christians will still be present and they will still be allowed to practice their religion. But if you want to be anything, you have to be a Muslim. If you want to be, let's say, a local government chairman, you have to be a Muslim. If you want to gain some favors, you have to be a Muslim. Okay. So Christians were increasingly marginalized, and people realized that if we're going to move forward in life, they had to become Muslims. So that is how eventually they did convert a whole lot swath. Of course, there were other regions where they used the sword to insist that people had to be Muslims, you know, but most of the time, what they just did was that they took over politically. Okay. Now, in the 10th century, I think the very first, if I'm getting my history right, and I can be corrected by my boss here, you know, but the 10th century, one of the very first issues that the Eastern Orthodox churches had was that they began to have this problem with, okay, no, it wasn't that. It was later. It was later. Okay, so the Nicene Creed was a creed that was actually disputed by many churches. Don't forget that Nicene was promulgated in 325 AD. So it was disputed by many churches, okay? And by the time many of the Eastern Orthodox churches did not accept, there's a particular clause in the Nicene Creed. I don't have the details here. I wish I could get it for you, you know, but there was a particular clause that kind of that said something about the Holy Spirit being God. Okay, the Eastern Orthodox churches, many of the bishops there didn't submit to that clause. All right, so eventually what happened was that the Roman Catholic Church, which was on the west, and the Eastern churches, which was on the right, I mean on the east, continued to divide over that subject. Eventually they will split. It is on paper that they split over that point of doctrine. Okay, but actually what led to the split was a political divide between the head, the Roman Catholic bishop in the west, that's in Rome, and the one in Constantinople. They were increasingly becoming competitive between themselves. So two things: there was a fight for power, and there was also a doctrinal distance. So that caused a divide. Now, don't forget, this happening what, 1054. When did Muhammad die? Muhammad died in 632. Okay, 1064, 632 to 1054 may look like 400 years, but throughout this 400 years, Islam had increasingly gained dominance in the East. So the Western church separated from the Eastern church, and the Eastern church is vulnerable to the increasing dominance of Islam. And what happens? Eventually, the Eastern churches didn't have the support of the West. Okay, because this support I'm talking about is military support. Usually you have to ward off the invasion of Islam with military force. They didn't have that, and Islam took over a lot of the East. Islam took over a lot of the eastern parts of the world, and the Eastern Orthodox churches are still present in the East, but not as dominant. So I'm hoping that I've answered the question. Bola, did I?
Yes, you did. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
I think also apart from the political, well, there was also the competition in between the 5 original bishoprics, which had dated back from about the 2nd and 3rd century. Because there were 4 bishoprics in the East. Yes. And there was only one in the West. And the only one in the West, of course, was the Bishop of Rome that we know, of course, now as the Pope. And then the 4 on the Eastern side. So that was always there. So even though the official schism was in 1054, yes, we know that the break had been happening for centuries before 1054. Now, then there was also the theological reasons, and there were many. There was the one you mentioned in the Nicene Creed, but there were also a lot of other things that had been going on, and the rivalry eventually moved over centuries. And then there were also the other church councils.
Okay, there were some other church councils too. Yes,
a lot of other church councils. It wasn't even 1 or 2. There were church councils after the Nicene. Of course, what the Nicene did was it told us that about it established fully about the Trinity, and all those other things. But there were a lot of other church councils, which essentially was what Rome was trying to do was to concentrate power within its own rank, which many of the other churches didn't agree with. So over time, things built up. Eventually, 1054 was like, okay, you go your way, we go our way. But unfortunately, what it did later on was that the Eastern churches got weaker. In the meantime, the Islamic powers rose, under the different caliphs, Uthman and all those other people, and they became stronger and stronger and stronger, even capturing Spain in the middle of all of that.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate it. In fact, I might not be able to move on with this discussion because this discussion is going to lead me now to the Protestant Reformation. So I'll just focus on that. Something else I probably wanted to add was that the Eastern churches, the Western church, Rome, the Western churches didn't completely leave the Eastern churches. Okay, they didn't completely leave the Eastern church. At some point, they realized the implication of the invasion of Islam and its increasing dominance in the East. And so they began to send warlords to the East to take over. In fact, the first, they called it the Crusades. Okay, so the very first crusade, they sent some warlords to go and take over the Holy Land. And they did take over the Holy Land. They took over Jerusalem, and the Crusaders ruled that place for a while until eventually it was taken over by some Muslim caliphs and so on. And then there were some other crusades also.
Iron also close.
Yes. So there were some other crusades also. What's his name? James White once said, he said that if that he's presently teaching church history. And he says that if he continues at this rate, he's going to finish, he will be part of church history by the time it finishes. So church history is quite a large subject, but I think it's important to just show clearly here that how the churches have evolved. Okay, the Eastern churches they are still in a very vulnerable situation right now because of Islam. And one of the beautiful things that is happening in our time, or in our day and time, is that Islam is coming to appreciate the fact that they cannot continue to gain dominance with violence. Okay, they are coming to appreciate that. So what many Muslims are doing, at least in Southwest Nigeria, and I'm observing that from the ministry and the life of our brother Korede Olawoyi, is that what many Muslims are doing now is that rather than use the sword, they are actually engaging Christians in dialogue, in debates, and so on. Even though it is new to them, and many of them are still using the force, some kind of force to gain dominance over those debates. But it is helpful, and it is yielding some result, because Christians are able to help them to look at their history, to help them to look at the man at the center of their religion, and to help them to appreciate the gospel in the process. Okay, so today we just did an overview of the last things we have been discussing. We touched on the three heresies, very, very important heresies, very, very important. I mean, I personally do not think that we'll appreciate what we have in Christianity today, except we understand Arianism, we understand Pelagianism, and we understand Islam. Those three, they are so very important. My paper on church history in seminary was actually written on Arianism. So I can actually send it to anybody who wants it on demand. Just some few things that I learned around that. Pelagianism also is also a very important doctrine, heresy that we need to understand. Islam is not new for us. It's something that is quite, let me use the word ubiquitous. So we all know it, and it's this. Okay, so next week, by God's grace, we'll move into the 16th century. I'm going to jump, okay? So I jumped from the 7th century to the 11th century. Now I'm going to the 16th century. There are so many, many things that are happening between those times that we still need to know. One other thing that probably I didn't touch, which is very important, is that we have the blessing of church history today because certain people preserved these documents for us. And you wouldn't believe who those people were. They were monks in monasteries, okay? Most of the documents we have today, the writings of Augustine, the writings of the church fathers, all of this were preserved by monks in monasteries, okay? In fact, it was monasteries. People used to send their children to monasteries to go and learn from these monks and then come back home. Okay, so it was monasteries that went on to become universities. Okay, so the very first set of universities, so you have certain monasteries that were good at maybe let's say science or history or whatever. And then you have another monastery that was good. Okay, so eventually the first set of universities that we had, which I believe started even in the medieval times, at that 11th century and so on, 12th century, all of them came as a result of monasteries coming together to combine their knowledge and to pass knowledge across. Okay, so we have all of these things stored away by monks. Okay, of course, the Protestants came and destroyed a bunch of what monk and monasteries are doing, you know, but it's still, we still want to appreciate God for what God used these people to do. Okay, all right. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for that contribution. I just looked at my time. I'm not sure how long I've gone, but I do not think that I'll be able to move forward. Or should I still just touch on one or two slides? Let me get a nay or a. Should I touch on one or two slides?
Yes.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you. So maybe I'll just touch on one or two slides and then we'll round up. I don't want to waste too much time. Okay. Oh, no, 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 no. Okay, so 1 minute. This thing is very, very new to me. Okay, so let's just look at this. All right, so a German monk by the name Martin Luther in the early 16th century, through his writing and with the advent of printing, began to share messages with ordinary people, showing them the way of salvation. Okay, so printing was invented in towards the end of the 15th century by a man called Gutenberg or something like that. The first book that was printed was the Bible, just to show how religious people were in those days. Okay, but even as of the time of Luther, Luther was born 1487 or thereabout. Okay, and he started coming into Protestant conviction while he was in the monastery, because he went on to join the monastery. You need to read up the life of Luther to know how he got into the monastery. So he went up to join the monastery, started having convictions around the Bible, okay, because of his own inherent sinfulness, okay, and that led him to begin to craft out the doctrine of justification by faith. I purposely didn't touch on the teachings of Luther here because I'm still going to touch on it when I get into the next chapter. Luther's teachings were not as the bishops of Rome had prescribed them, but they were clearly the teachings that were delineated from the Bible. In fact, after a few years, when Luther, Zwingli, and the rest, they came to find out that, look, the best thing they needed to do as teachers of the Bible, they just started to teach the Bible straight away. They taught expositionally, okay? I think it must have been 1531 that Zwingli, January 1530, the very first Sunday, Zwingli just started to teach the Bible from scriptures directly. You know, Martin Luther was condemned as a heretic by the Church of Rome, but his movement had long taken over most of Europe. Had long taken over most of Europe. By the middle of the 16th century, most of Europe had become Protestant, and you wouldn't believe it, and this is very true. The Protestant movement actually moved like wildfire. Okay, why? Because many people had gotten tired of the Roman Catholic Church and many of their excesses. So they saw and they welcomed the the newness of the Protestant religion. So they actually, a lot of people, a lot of countries and a lot of people subscribe to the Protestant religion. But the Catholics will roll out a counter-reformation, that's another story entirely, through a man called Ignatius of Loyola, and restore a lot of Protestant countries back to Roman Catholicism. But the religion that Luther taught, which was further put in finance by men by Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin, became a force to reckon with in Europe. This is what brought about the birth of Reformed Christianity. The heart of the Reformed faith is a contention for the gospel, a call to restore the message of salvation that is able to save men from their sins. Okay, so while the Reformed message might be disputed by people today, the fact still remains that Reformed theology is a message that focuses a lot on this whole matter of how are men and how is a man saved? How does God save human beings? Okay, it was the whole matter, the whole discussion centered on something we call soteriology. Okay, how is a man saved? And that is what my discussion also in this series of discussion is aimed at. Okay, so I want to thank everybody that's joined. I brought my discussion to a close today. Paul Owolabi is back again. Do we have any question or any contribution? You can actually unmute your video if you want to ask your question. If not, then I'll just bring the discussion to a close. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining. It's been very, very encouraging to have you. Okay, so yeah, stop the recording.